The barracks smelled of oil, dust, and stubborn doubt. When Elena first walked through the gates of the training compound, she felt the weight of every skeptical eye drilling into her back. The men weren't subtle. Some smirked, others openly muttered under their breath, and a few just stared with the sort of hardened pity reserved for someone who had no idea what they were walking into. She had heard it before she even applied. Women didn't belong in the sniper division. Snipers were hunters, shadows in the forest, creatures of patience and perfect stillness. It was a discipline of brutal calm, where a steady trigger finger mattered more than brute strength, but tradition clung hard to the ranks, and tradition said women couldn't handle it. Elena didn't answer their smirks with words. She only adjusted the strap of the rifle case on her shoulder and walked straight ahead. Her boots struck the gravel in rhythm, and every step was a promise. She hadn't come to prove them wrong with talk, she had come to rewrite what they thought was possible. The first day of marksmanship training was meant to break recruits. The sun was merciless, beating down on the firing range with the kind of heat that pulled sweat from your skin even before you lifted your weapon. Instructors barked orders, demanded impossible accuracy at impossible speeds, and treated hesitation like weakness. The men cursed under their breath, their shots scattering wildly, frustration rising with every misfire. Elena's first turn at the line was almost quiet in comparison. She didn't rush, she inhaled, feeling the air expand her chest, then let it out slow like the whisper of a secret. Her finger found the trigger, her eye the scope, and the world outside the target blurred into nothing. The crack of her rifle rolled across the field, and the bullet met the bullseye with surgical precision. Another shot, another hit. By the third, even the instructor's voice faltered. By the fifth, the men had stopped laughing. But Elena knew better than to bask in small victories. One good day could always be dismissed as luck, one good shot explained away as coincidence. What mattered was consistency, and she was prepared to grind herself into the dirt to achieve it. When the others collapsed on their bunks at night, she stayed behind at the range, working until her shoulders ached and her eyes burned from the scope's glass. She memorized the way wind tugged at a bullet's path, studied the way light bent across terrain at different hours, and trained her breathing to slow until her heartbeat was the only sound she could hear. Each lesson, each moment of fatigue, each whisper of doubt, she absorbed it all and turned it into focus. She wasn't just learning to shoot, she was learning to wait, to endure, to become invisible in a world that wanted her to stand out only to fail. The second phase of training wasn't about the rifle, it was about the mind. A sniper without discipline is just a shooter, the instructors said, and discipline meant patience beyond reason. They sent recruits into the wilderness with nothing but their rifles, a canteen, and the clothes on their backs. They were ordered to stalk a target, a flag placed miles away, guarded by trainers who scanned the field with binoculars. To reach it, you had to crawl for hours, maybe days, through mud, grass, and thorns while remaining unseen. Most men hated this part, grumbling as insects bit at their skin and sweat burned into their eyes. Elena didn't complain. She embraced the silence. Inch by inch, she slid her body across the earth, feeling each blade of grass brush her cheek, watching every shift of shadow as the sun arced overhead. Where others saw torment, she saw rhythm. Every breath, every pause, every drag of her elbows was a calculation. She became part of the ground itself, invisible to the guards who searched for movement. At one point, a trainer stood so close she could see the leather of his boots, could hear the faint crackle of his radio as he scanned the horizon. Elena pressed her body flat, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but she did not move. The trainer's gaze swept right over her and passed on. Hours later, when she finally reached the flag, she planted her mark with quiet certainty. She wasn't the fastest that day, but she was one of the few who hadn't been spotted at all, and the instructors knew that was worth more than speed. Still, victories only seemed to fuel resentment among the others. In the mess hall, men shoved past her, muttered insults into their trays, and sometimes accidentally spilled drinks near her seat. One evening, a recruit named Kravitz decided to test her patience outright. "You think a few lucky shots make you one of us?" he sneered loud enough for the whole room to hear. Elena didn't rise to the bait. She looked him straight in the eye, calm and unshaken, and returned to her meal. Silence spread across the hall like wildfire, ignoring him cut deeper than any insult. But inside, she knew the hostility wasn't going away, it was sharpening. To endure, she would have to be sharper still. The weeks turned into months and the training grew harsher. Night exercises forced recruits to navigate forests without maps or light, guided only by instinct and memory. Some got lost, wandering in circles until dawn. Elena pressed on, tracing the outlines of trees with her fingertips, listening to the way branches swayed differently under the wind. She learned to move without snapping a twig, to feel the slope of the land beneath her boots as if the earth itself whispered directions. Her instructors took notice. "She listens better than most men shoot," one muttered under his breath after she returned first from a night drill with barely a sound. By the time final evaluations approached, Elena's reputation had changed. She was no longer just the woman trying to do the impossible, she was the silent competitor no one wanted to be paired against. The last test was designed to break even the strongest. A simulated mission across treacherous terrain with limited rations, while being hunted by trainers playing the role of enemy scouts. Failure meant discovery. Success meant endurance. Elena carried her rifle like an extension of her body and moved into the field without hesitation. Days passed. The nights were cold, the days scorching, and hunger clawed at her stomach. But she kept her focus sharp, her body low, her senses attuned. She outlasted the pursuers, reached the objective, and set her sights on the target with hands steady as stone. The shot rang out, clean and precise. When the dust settled and the scores were posted, Elena's name was near the very top, not just for marksmanship but for stealth, endurance, and discipline. The record was undeniable. The same voices that had once dismissed her as a novelty now had to swallow their doubt, though many refused to admit it aloud. But Elena didn't care for their grudging respect. What mattered was that she had made it this far, through mud, hunger, heat, and ridicule, without breaking. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The real test was not in training but on the battlefield, where bullets flew in both directions and mistakes were paid for in blood. She had proven she belonged among the best. Now she was ready to show the world. The warfront smelled different from training grounds. Gunpowder clung to the air, smoke curled in choking veils above shattered buildings, and the ground trembled beneath distant artillery. Elena had been deployed with her unit to a contested valley, where the enemy controlled high ridges overlooking a crucial supply route. Convoys had been ambushed for weeks, and the brass finally ordered snipers forward to neutralize the threat. It was the kind of mission that separated soldiers from survivors, and as Elena shouldered her rifle, she felt the weight of history pressing on her spine. She was the only woman in the squad, surrounded by men who still doubted she could hold her nerve when bullets sliced the air. They whispered about her in foxholes, calling her dead weight, assuming she would crumble under the first taste of real bloodshed. Elena didn't argue. She listened, silent, as the convoy rolled below and the commander ordered the snipers into position. The climb up the ridge was brutal. Loose rocks shifted under every step, the wind howled through jagged cliffs, and the sun baked sweat into their fatigues. By the time they reached a vantage point, some were already breathing raggedly. Elena, steady as always, pressed her body against the earth and extended her rifle toward the horizon. Through her scope, the world narrowed into clarity. She saw the enemy, shadows darting between rocks, rifles glinting in the light, eyes sharp as predators waiting for prey. Her squad leader whispered coordinates, but Elena already had them measured, distance and wind accounted for in her mind. A crack split the silence. Her first bullet found its mark, dropping a sentry before he had time to lift his scope. Another followed, striking the spotter beside him. The ridge exploded in chaos. Enemy snipers retaliated, bullets shrieking overhead, chipping stone into their faces. Some of her squad cursed, fumbling for cover. One man broke position entirely, scrambling downslope in panic. Elena didn't move. Her breathing slowed, her pulse softened, and she squeezed the trigger again. Each shot was deliberate, almost cold, as if time itself bent to her rhythm. She didn't fire wildly, she hunted, eliminating threats one by one, until the opposing ridge grew eerily quiet. When the smoke cleared, it was her shots that had silenced the ambush. The convoy below rolled safely through, engines growling against the valley floor. Back at camp, silence hung heavier than applause. The men who had mocked her now kept their distance, staring with a mix of unease and reluctant respect. One finally muttered, "She saved our skins," and though no one dared argue, they still couldn't quite bring themselves to treat her as an equal. Elena didn't ask for recognition. She sat by her rifle, cleaning it with calm precision, her face unreadable. In truth, inside her chest, her heart still thudded with the memory of the fight, the way the world had shrunk into a tunnel of scope and target, the way fear had tried to claw at her but never won. It hadn't been easy. She had felt terror, she had smelled death. But she had not let it control her. More missions followed. Each one was more dangerous, each one demanded more of her patience, endurance, and will. Sometimes it meant lying in the dirt for hours without moving, her body stiff, her stomach growling, just to wait for the perfect moment. Other times it meant relocating under fire, crawling through mud while shells rained down overhead. She began to understand the strange psychology of her role, the quiet loneliness of a sniper, always at the edge of the battlefield, fighting unseen, her victories measured not in medals but in the silence after an enemy fell. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Officers took notice. Reports highlighted her precision, her uncanny ability to read terrain, her composure under fire. She wasn't just surviving the battlefield, she was excelling. One evening, after returning from a particularly grueling mission that had left half her squad wounded, the commander approached her privately. "You're not just good," he said, his voice graveled with sincerity. "You're rewriting the book." She didn't reply, only nodded, but those words etched themselves deep inside her. She hadn't come for praise but for proof that she belonged here, that the doubts of others meant nothing against the evidence of her skill. Yet, with every success came a heavier shadow. The enemy had taken note as well. Snipers fought their own hidden war, and rumors spread of a rival marksman, a ghost on the ridge who never missed and who had begun hunting her squad specifically. For Elena, it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed. And in that inevitable duel, there would be no second chances. The duel began long before the first shot. It started with rumors that spread through the camp like wildfire. An enemy marksman whose bullets seemed to find soldiers through cover, whose presence turned open ground into a death trap. Men whispered his name as though speaking it too loudly might summon him. They called him the Phantom, a shadow that haunted every valley crossing and ridge line. Elena didn't indulge in superstition, but she listened closely. Every sniper has a pattern, and patterns can be broken. What unsettled her wasn't the fear in the men's voices, it was the quiet challenge in her own chest. She knew, with the certainty of instinct, that sooner or later the Phantom would come for her. The chance arrived during a mission to secure high ground above a ruined village. Recon said the Phantom had been active in the area, and Elena's squad was tasked with holding position until reinforcements could arrive. The terrain was brutal, charred buildings crumbling under the weight of past shelling, shattered glass crunching under boots, and fields of twisted metal that glared in the sun like teeth. The squad spread out cautiously, setting observation posts and digging shallow hides. Elena found her perch in the husk of a building, half its roof torn away, giving her a clear view of the valley below. She settled into stillness, her cheek against the rifle's stock, scope sweeping the horizon. Hours passed. Silence weighed heavy, broken only by the occasional bark of distant gunfire. And then, movement. At first it was nothing, a flicker at the edge of vision, too subtle to mark. But Elena trusted her instincts. She stilled her breath, scanning inch by inch. There, across the ridge, a shimmer like heat rising off stone, just out of place enough to betray intent. Her finger tightened against the trigger. But she stopped. It was bait. Too clean, too obvious. The Phantom was good. He wanted her to take the shot, to reveal herself. Elena let the crosshairs hover, then slowly eased her finger off the trigger. Minutes dragged into an hour, the tension pulling at her muscles like wire. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply waited. The first shot came without warning. A crack split the air, and the wall beside her cheek exploded in a spray of dust. He had found her. She rolled back instinctively, heart pounding, ears ringing. Another shot followed, grazing the ledge where her scope had rested. The Phantom was zeroed in on her hide, and every second she stayed meant death. She crawled low, shifting positions with painstaking care, forcing herself to slow down despite the rush of adrenaline. To panic was to die. She found another angle, deeper in the rubble, and scanned again. Nothing. He was gone, swallowed by the terrain. Hours turned into a deadly game of silence. Each time she thought she had him, the glint vanished. Each time she repositioned, another shot whispered past, close enough to taste the grit it kicked up. He was hunting her as surely as she was hunting him. The squad grew restless, pinned down by a sniper they couldn't see. Some shouted in frustration, others begged her to finish it. Elena ignored them all. This wasn't about noise. It was about patience. And patience was her weapon. The sun began to sink, shadows stretching long across the valley. Most snipers avoided dusk. Light shifted too quickly, vision played tricks. But Elena saw opportunity. She remembered her training. Light bends differently at the close of day, silhouettes betray themselves against the fading horizon. She slowed her breathing, focused not on movement but on stillness, and there, at the crest of a rock, just before the light bled into night, she saw it. The faintest outline of a scope. Barely a whisper of reflection. That was him. That was the Phantom. Her pulse steadied. She aligned the crosshairs, every muscle taut but controlled. The world narrowed to silence. For a heartbeat, she thought of the men who had said women couldn't be snipers, of every sneer, every insult, every doubt. She thought of the endless nights on the training range, the insects biting at her skin during stalks, the cold hours waiting for a target to move. All of it led here. She exhaled. Slowly. Quietly. Her fingers squeezed. The shot cut through the dusk like lightning. The reflection vanished. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a body slumped from the ridge, tumbling down stone and dust until it lay still at the bottom of the valley. Silence swallowed the battlefield. No counterfire came. No glint of another scope. The phantom was gone. When the squad finally exhaled, their relief spilled into words. Cheers, laughter, shouts of disbelief. They rushed to her side, some clapping her on the back, others staring in stunned silence. Elena didn't smile. She didn't raise her arms in victory. She only cleaned her rifle, her face calm, her voice even. He made one mistake, she said softly, almost to herself. He thought I'd break first. That night, around the campfires, the story spread like wildfire. The woman sniper who had hunted the phantom, who had ended the ghost that stalked them all. Some called it luck, others called it impossible. But for the first time, no one dared say she didn't belong. She hadn't just survived the duel, she had rewritten the battlefield itself. After the phantom's death, Elena's name traveled faster than any bullet. Soldiers spoke of her in the same breath as battles themselves, as if she were not a person but a force of nature shaping the outcome of the war. Her reputation became a weapon, one as sharp as the rifle she carried. Enemy scouts hesitated before peeking over ridges, commanders adjusted tactics when her unit was deployed, and even seasoned veterans found reassurance in her calm presence on the field. The Army's leadership, once reluctant to acknowledge her, could no longer ignore the record she was building. Dispatches carried her successes up the chain of command, confirmed kills, completed missions, squads saved from ambushes, and soon she was summoned to headquarters for official recognition. The ceremony was brief, stiff, and cold. Medals gleamed under harsh lights as generals pinned honors to her uniform. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes about the unexpected hero who had broken barriers. Elena stood at attention, her face composed, her body still, though inside she felt the weight of contradiction. She hadn't joined for applause. She hadn't endured mud, hunger, and prejudice for medals. She had come to do her duty, to protect her comrades, to prove, perhaps only to herself, that she belonged where others said she could not. Yet she also knew the power of this moment. Every photograph that left that hall carried more than her face. It carried proof that the old rules, the ones that barred women from the role she now embodied, could be shattered. The weeks that followed blurred into relentless missions. Each operation grew more daring, as if commanders tested how far they could push the legend they had created. Elena was inserted deep behind enemy lines, tasked with eliminating supply officers, halting convoys, or sowing chaos before major offensives. Her rifle spoke where diplomacy failed. She became a shadow that haunted maps, a variable enemy generals dreaded. And yet, with each success, she felt the toll mount. A sniper's victories were counted not in medals but in silence. The silence after a trigger was pulled, the silence of lives ended. She bore it all with a steady face, but in the quiet hours between missions, she wondered how much of herself was being consumed by the legend she was becoming. Among her comrades, however, she had transformed from outsider to cornerstone. The same men who once mocked her now deferred to her judgment. Before setting camp, they asked her where the safest ground lay. Before crossing valleys, they waited for her signal. In firefights, they followed her lead without hesitation. Respect had not come easily, it had been bought with sweat, patience, and unflinching precision, but it was real now. One night, as they huddled in a trench while shells thundered above, a soldier whispered to her, "You don't just keep us alive. You give us hope." Elena didn't reply, but she carried those words with her, heavier than any medal. The enemy, too, had taken notice. They put bounties on her head, spreading her name across wanted lists. Enemy snipers studied her patterns, desperate to avenge the phantom. Rumors spread of squads dedicated to hunting her specifically, yet none succeeded. Each attempt to silence her only deepened her legend. And with each duel, each mission, each impossible shot, she felt herself pulled further from the young recruit who had walked into training with nothing but determination and silence. She had become something else, something larger than herself, larger than fear, larger than doubt. But legends, she knew, came at a price. She had seen it in the eyes of soldiers broken by combat, men who could no longer sleep without flinching at shadows. She felt it in her own bones after days lying motionless in the dirt, her muscles screaming, her mind fraying at the edges from the sheer strain of patience. She learned to carry the weight, to lock it deep inside, but sometimes in the rare quiet when the battlefield seemed far away, she allowed herself to remember why she had started. She remembered the voices that told her she couldn't, and the fire they had lit in her chest. She remembered the stubbornness that had carried her through mud and ridicule. And she realized that even if the war consumed her entirely, she had already proven them wrong. Yet the war wasn't finished with her. Whispers came down from command of a coming offensive that would decide the fate of the front. It would require every ounce of skill, patience, and endurance she possessed. Her name was already etched into the history of the conflict, but this operation, the most dangerous yet, would test whether she was truly just a soldier rewriting records, or something even greater. The order came at dawn, carried by a courier whose face was pale with the weight of what he bore. Command was preparing for a massive push across the valley, one that could fracture enemy lines and swing the war in their favor. But the ridge overlooking the battlefield was a fortress, lined with heavy machine guns, mortars, and snipers who had already decimated multiple attempts to advance. The generals needed those guns silenced before the offensive could begin, and they needed it done quietly. The task was suicide for most units. For Elena it was another challenge. She listened as her commander explained the plan. She would infiltrate ahead of the army, alone, and dismantle the ridge's defenses one shot at a time, clearing the way for the troops below. If she failed, the offensive would collapse and thousands would die in the valley. It wasn't an assignment, it was a burden. But Elena accepted it with the same calm she always carried. She moved at night, the stars hidden behind drifting clouds, the ground damp from the day's rain. Her rifle was strapped across her back, her hands pressed into the mud as she crawled mile after mile toward the ridge. Every sound was magnified, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, the faint crunch of boots patrolling above. Twice she froze as enemy patrols passed close enough that she could smell the tobacco on their breath. She didn't move, didn't even blink until the danger passed. Hours blurred into eternity, but at last she found her position. A shallow rise in the earth with a narrow slit of view into the enemy's defenses. She dug in, belly pressed to the ground, rifle sliding into place. And then she waited. Dawn crept over the horizon, staining the sky pale gold. Through her scope, the enemy encampment stirred to life. Soldiers moved between sandbags, loading ammunition, checking rifles. Mortar teams adjusted their tubes, scanning the valley as if already sensing the storm that would soon arrive. Elena slowed her breathing, letting her pulse steady into rhythm. The first target presented itself, a machine gunner stretching, his weapon idle. One shot cracked through the morning stillness and he dropped before he even understood. The camp froze. Shouts erupted, soldiers dove for cover, eyes searching the ridges for the ghost that had struck. Elena had already shifted, moving her scope to the mortar crew. Another shot. Another body fell. The battle became a dance of patience and precision. Each time the enemy tried to man their weapons, Elena's rifle spoke, silencing them before they could fire. She shifted positions constantly, crawling through mud and stone, never firing from the same place twice. Bullets tore the air around her as enemy snipers scoured the ridge, desperate to root her out, but she was always one step ahead. Hours passed like minutes. Her body ached, her stomach twisted with hunger, but her mind was locked in a state of focus so complete the world outside her scope barely existed. She was no longer Elena the recruit, Elena the woman. They had tried to define her by what she wasn't. Now she was only what she had become: the rifle, the shadow, the silence. By mid-afternoon the ridge was chaos. Enemy guns lay abandoned, their crews either dead or cowering behind shattered walls. The valley below stirred with movement, her army advancing, pouring forward with the confidence that the guns above would no longer cut them down. Explosions roared as artillery joined the push, and still Elena worked, ensuring no desperate last stand rose from the enemy lines. She spotted an officer barking orders, rallying troops for a counterstrike. One breath, one squeeze and he crumpled, their resistance faltering instantly. With every pull of the trigger, the battle shifted further toward victory. But victory always demanded a price. As she adjusted for her final shot of the day, a sudden flash erupted from the ridge opposite her. An enemy sniper had found her, and the bullet screamed so close it seared the air beside her ear. Dirt exploded around her, the force knocking her sideways. For a heartbeat, disorientation clawed at her. The next shot could already be on its way. She forced herself flat, breath shallow, eyes darting through the scope for the glint of glass that betrayed her hunter. Nothing. only shifting shadows and smoke. She stayed motionless, heart-pounding, waiting. Minutes dragged, the silence unbearable. And then, there. The faintest flicker of reflection, hidden behind the ruins of a bunker. She didn't think. She acted. Her shot split the air. The reflection vanished, followed by the distant slump of a body falling behind cover. Silence returned, heavier than before. Elena exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. The ridge was broken. The valley belonged to her army now. And as the sound of advancing troops filled the distance, she allowed herself a rare moment of release. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of what she had done. Hundreds, maybe thousands, would live because of her today. But she also knew she had crossed another line. Each battle left a mark, not just on her record but on her soul. And the war was far from over. The ridge fell, the valley opened, and the offensive surged forward like a river breaking a dam. 4 weeks afterward, soldiers spoke of that morning in hushed awe, retelling the story of a lone sniper who had dismantled an entire fortress with nothing but patience and precision. Elena's name carried through trenches, across camps, and into the halls of command. She was no longer just a soldier, she was a symbol. Newspapers ran her story under bold headlines, though often twisted it into something almost mythic: the angel of death, the shadow huntress, the woman who toppled the ridge. Elena didn't care for nicknames. She was not an angel nor a myth, she was a soldier doing what had to be done. But the machine of war devoured stories as hungrily as it devoured lives, and her legend was too powerful to resist. With fame came attention she had never wanted. High-ranking officers visited her in the field, shaking her hand with smiles that did not reach their eyes. They praised her record, her bravery, her unique contribution. Some of them spoke as though she were a tool, a weapon to wield, not a human being. Invitations came for interviews, for speeches, for propaganda photographs. Each time she declined, preferring the solitude of her rifle and the quiet of the battlefield over the glare of cameras. But she couldn't fully escape it. Even among her comrades there was a shift. They still respected her, still trusted her with their lives, but now they also looked at her differently, as though she were no longer one of them but something set apart. Isolation, once her strength, now became her curse. The toll revealed itself in shadows under her eyes, in the stiffness of her body after long missions, in the way silence began to press heavier than before. She dreamed of the phantom sometimes, of the officer who had crumpled mid-command, of the countless faces she had seen only through the narrow tunnel of her scope. She woke with her hands clenched, her breathing ragged. No one saw, of course, she never allowed them to. In the daylight, she was steady, unshakable, the sniper who could not miss. But in the hours between dusk and dawn, the ghosts of her record crept closer. Yet war did not pause for the soul's wounds. New orders came, new missions assigned. She obeyed, always precise, always silent. But she also began to notice how the battlefield itself reacted to her presence. Enemy soldiers who once fought ferociously now hesitated when they knew she was in the sector. Entire units altered their strategies, terrified of the unseen bullet that might end them before they even glimpsed their foe. She had become more than a sniper. She was psychological warfare, a shadow stitched into the minds of both sides. And that terrified her more than the bullets. To be feared meant she was effective. But to be dehumanized into a legend meant losing pieces of herself with each mission. It was during a rare lull in the fighting that Elena found herself sitting with her commander, a man hardened by years at war. They shared a flask of bitter liquor, the silence between them broken only by the crackle of a fire. At length he spoke. "Do you know what you've become?" She didn't answer. He continued, "You've turned the war itself on its head. You've done what none of us believed possible. But legends burn fast. And they burn alone." She looked into the fire, its flames licking upward, consuming everything in their reach. She said nothing, but his words stayed with her long after. Still she pressed on. Duty was a chain she refused to break. If the price of rewriting history was loneliness, she would pay it. If the cost of survival was silence, she would endure it. And if carrying the burden of ghosts meant that others lived, then she would shoulder them all. Because beneath the medals, the whispers, the myths, Elena remembered the truth. She had been told women couldn't be snipers, couldn't endure, couldn't stand where she stood now. And every day she drew breath, every bullet she placed with precision, was a defiance of that lie. But deep within her, a question began to grow, quiet yet insistent. When the war ended, what would be left of her? Would she still be Elena, or only the shadow she had become? The answer lingered beyond the horizon, waiting with the next battle. The war did not end with a bang but with a slow unraveling, battles thinning into skirmishes, the roar of artillery replaced by uneasy silences across ruined landscapes. Elena was still at her post until the very last shots were fired, her rifle never far from her side, her eyes scanning horizons even when there was no longer an enemy to hunt. When the armistice was signed, cheers erupted through the camps, soldiers embracing with tears and laughter, but Elena stood apart. For her, the end brought no rush of joy, only a quiet, hollow stillness. She had survived. Her comrades had lived because of her. The war was over, yet the echoes of its violence still beat within her chest. For the first time in years, she lowered her rifle without the certainty that she would need it again. And that simple act, setting it down, felt heavier than any mission she had ever carried. Command summoned her again, this time not for medals but for ceremonies. They wanted her face plastered on posters, her story told as proof of progress, of courage, of triumph. Elena complied only when duty required it, standing stiff before flashing cameras, offering short answers to questions about how she felt, breaking records, rewriting history, silencing doubters. Inside, the questions stung more than they celebrated. They always asked about being a woman first, a sniper second, as though her gender mattered more than the comrades she saved or the enemy she outwitted. She gave them the same calm answer each time: I was a soldier. That's all. But history was already shaping her into something else, something she could not fully control. When she finally returned home, she found a world that looked familiar yet foreign. Streets bustled with civilians who had only known the war through newspapers and broadcasts. Some recognized her face, whispering as she passed, pointing her out like a figure stepped from legend. Strangers approached her in markets, thanking her, praising her, asking for stories. Elena nodded politely, but the distance between their world and hers felt immeasurable. They did not know the smell of gunpowder in the dawn, the silence of waiting days for a single shot, the weight of lives taken in the name of lives saved. They saw her medals, her headlines, her myth. They did not see the ghosts. Yet not all recognition was hollow. She received letters from young women across the country, students, workers, daughters, who wrote of how her story had changed them. They told me I couldn't study engineering, but then I read about you. They said girls couldn't serve, but you proved them wrong. Each letter was a mirror of her own past, the disbelief she had faced, the voices that had said no. And for the first time, Elena began to understand that her fight had stretched beyond the battlefield. She had not only rewritten the record books of war, she had opened doors for others who would come after. Still, peace was its own battle. At night she dreamed of ridges and shadows, of the phantom scope gleaming in twilight, of soldiers collapsing through her crosshairs. She woke with her heart pounding, sweat chilling her skin, the silence of her small apartment deafening compared to the chaos she once knew. Therapy was offered, though she accepted little of it, preferring to walk in forests, to feel earth and leaves under her boots, to remind herself of life that grew rather than life that ended. Slowly the world softened at the edges, though the sharpness never fully faded. She carried it always, just as she carried the rifle scars on her shoulder. In time, historians wrote of her campaigns, instructors taught her tactics to new generations, and military academies cited her patience and precision as lessons in discipline. Some accounts painted her as flawless, others as ruthless, but the truth, Elena knew, lived only in the quiet between shots, in the long hours when no one watched her endure. She never sought to correct them. She understood now that legends were not owned by the people who lived them, they belonged to those who needed them. If her story gave someone strength, then the truth of her solitude was a price worth paying. Years later, at a ceremony commemorating the war, an old comrade approached her with tears in his eyes. "You saved us more times than I can count," he said. "We owe you everything." She shook her head gently. "You owe me nothing," she replied. "We all carried our part." But when she returned home that night and stood before the mirror, she allowed herself a rare smile. Not for the medals, not for the headlines, but for the memory of walking into a training camp years ago with nothing but determination, and proving, step by step, that every doubt, every sneer, every barrier had been wrong. And so Elena's name remained, etched not only in the record books but in the unspoken courage of those who followed. She had begun as the woman they said could never be a sniper, and ended as the sniper who changed what could never be said again. The end.